our keynote address. Welcome back, everybody. Those of you just joining us, great to have you here. Those of you who came back, I'm glad you did. And of course, because why wouldn't you? This is an amazing program. I've been using a lot of superlatives today to describe our speakers. I assure you that is not because I always do this for everybody, but because we truly do have an amazing group of scholars with us today. And our keynote is absolutely no exception. I'm pleased to introduce, so we've got our keynote, Matthew Mason, and just a heads up, he's going to be speaking for between 45 and 50 minutes. Then he will take your questions. Then we'll have a very brief intermission and then reconvene all of our morning panelists with Professor Mason for an all-scholar roundtable mediated by me, in which they'll be speaking with and to each other, as well as taking your questions. So we will begin. Matthew Mason, Professor of History at Brigham Young University. He is one of the foremost authorities on the political debates over slavery in the early years of the American Republic, particularly how New Englanders mobilized around the issue. Among his many distinctions, he is a founding member and co-director of the Historians Against Slavery organization and continues to be a scholarly voice confronting the persistence of forms of slavery in the 21st century, as well as the legacies of enslavement in the United States today, including mass incarceration and other forms of systemic injustice. Mason has published a number of highly regarded articles on the politics of slavery in early 19th century New England, and along with co-editing several excellent volumes, has written 2 books. One, a political biography of Edward Everett, and the other, another one of my personal favorites, a tour de force examining and entitled Slavery and Politics in the Early American Republic. Without further ado, I give you Matthew Mason.
Thank you, Ian, for that very generous introduction. I hope you can hear me. Everyone can hear me well, but Ian has assured me he will let me know if you can't. It's a great honor for me to be invited to be part of this really distinguished and very interesting group of scholars, and this day exploring Maine history. The only thing, of course, that I regret is that we're not in Portland. I love Portland. I love the Maine Historical Association. I have great memories of doing research at the Maine Historical Association in personal papers collections, as well as newspapers and pamphlets that really inform what I'm going to be talking about today. And of course, I just love Portland. This is the first place I ever had monkfish. It's the first place I ever had, there's a particular ice cream place that had grape nuts in the ice cream. It's fantastic. Where was it? Oh yeah, I'm talking about history. I got sidetracked there. This is an interesting moment to be talking about something as complicated as the politics of slavery in Maine. It's an interesting moment because of the degree to which memory of past and ongoing practices of racism and slavery is in the news. What makes it interesting is that as historians, and I'm certainly one of them, when we encounter the history, including, as you'll see, the history of Maine's early interactions with slavery and statehood, we as academic historians especially are very interested in telling a complicated story. And history, to the degree we can make it so, is meant to be kind of cool and rational, get in the archives and interpret what you find. And whereas memory, how we commemorate that history, is anything but those things. It is immediate, it is personal. I mean, just in recent days and years, we've seen people killed in Virginia and New Mexico over issues of memory. Because memory speaks to what we value now as we commemorate that history. And so there's not a lot of room for nuance. We commemorate history in order to either celebrate or condemn it. There's not, so I understand the moment we're in as a moment in America in general, as a moment in which we're reckoning with memory. And so therefore it's an interesting time to be thinking about the political complications of how Mainers interacted with slavery at the statehood moment that I'll be talking about. And interestingly, even a lot of the historiography, the literature written by professional historians debating slavery and politics in the 19th century is not always nuanced. A lot of the recent scholarship builds on the idea that we need to find whether people were either anti-slavery or pro-slavery, without a lot of room in between. But for me, a much more useful way to think about Northerners in the 18th and 19th centuries as they thought about politics and slavery was formulated in 1976, many, many years ago, by the great historian David Potter. And when I first presented my research on Maine and slavery politics, Michael Morrison was the commentator at the Southern Historical Association, and he pointed my attention in his comments to David Potter as a way to understand these people, because David Potter framed it as not an issue of competing alternatives. You're either anti-slavery or you are pro-slavery, but instead as a matter of competing priorities. The way he put it, I'll just give you a few ideas. Historians' recognition that slavery, in one aspect or another, pervaded all the aspects of sectionalism, the struggle between the North and the South, has left historians content to ask a simple question. Did the people of the North really oppose slavery? Rather than a complex question, what was the rank of anti-slavery in the hierarchy of Northern values? And I think that complex version of that question helps us perceive how we can take most, if not all, Northerners in the aftermath of the American Revolution were anti-slavery in principle. But the way they acted against or in relationship to slavery had to do with how that interacted with some of their other values and priorities. The way Potter put it, the question for them became not a choice of alternatives, anti-slavery or pro-slavery, but a ranking of values. The difference between anti-slavery men and conciliationists, the way he put it, in the North was not a question of what they thought about slavery alone, but of how they ranked these priorities. And I think that's a really useful way to understand the things I'm going to be talking about today. Mainers, as they debated how to rank anti-slavery in their list of priorities when preserving the Union and pressingly gaining statehood were the other priorities that were in play. Interestingly, a related point to that first point about David Potter's ideas, a lot of the standard rendering by historians of the sectional politics of slavery between the Missouri Crisis, 1819 to 1821, and the Civil War, is a tale of recurring and increasingly intense division and polarization, and the North becoming increasingly anti-slavery, while the Southern section of the nation becomes increasingly pro-slavery. And there's obviously, that's a major part of the story, but that version of the story where Northerners are constantly moving in an anti-slavery direction makes it hard to explain the people known as dough faces. It's one of the great, we don't give political nicknames like they did back in the day. It's one of the great political nicknames of all time, the idea of dough faces. It was coined during the Missouri Crisis by John Randolph. John Randolph was a total piece of work, a senator from Virginia who, he'd be a whole other talk. But during the Missouri debate, he referred to Northerners as dough faces. And because it was John Randolph, and because he was such a colorful character, a lot of people didn't quite know what he meant and didn't quite dare to ask him. So therefore, speculation became rampant about what it actually meant. The historian Nick Wood has done a really nice job of investigating the term, but the term came to mean kind of soft on slavery, dough like the Pillsbury Doughboy, soft on slavery. Northerners who were willing to compromise with the South on issues surrounding slavery. It was coined right in the middle of the Missouri Crisis. that has a Maine context that I'll be talking about. If you believe that the North is constantly polarizing, it's hard to explain how doughfaces could even survive in Northern politics. So the normal story, even of the Missouri Crisis, is that there were 18 Northerners in the House of Representatives who voted to compromise with slavery, and only 5 of them were reelected. So that is the tale of Northerners being punished for selling out their anti-slavery constituents. But I found myself interested, what about those 5? This is not total annihilation of doughfacism, and doughfacism keeps on trucking after this. The willingness to compromise with the South, which I call doughfacism, continue to prosper in American politics. So I think another way to look at antebellum politics of slavery, beginning with the Missouri Crisis, is what about those 5? And under what circumstances were they able to thrive and even beyond surviving? One of the things that the doughfaces constantly argued is that it went a little something like this: I'm as anti-slavery as you, but I care about these other issues more. And for some voters, that came to be a compelling explanation of why you would ever compromise with the South on slavery. Maine did not provide an unusual number of doughfaces, an unusually high number. Only the district at that point, before it became a state, the District of Maine had 7 representatives in the House of Representatives. 2 of them became doughfaces, voted for compromise with the South, the famous Missouri Compromise. 5 of them voted against it. And so in terms of proportion, that's not an unusually high number. But one thing that I found that was unusual about Maine was that in the post-compromise spin and recriminations between those who voted for the compromise and those who voted against it, the doughfaces who voted for compromise were arguing from a position of strength. Whereas the restrictionists, the people who voted to restrict slavery in Missouri, so they voted against the slavery compromise, they were known as restrictionists. Those 5 found they had to explain themselves to Maine voters because of the particular context and ranking of values that many Maine voters placed during this debate. So looking at the Missouri Crisis from the Maine point of view, I think is really instructive of more than Maine. Maine is interesting in itself. I don't need to tell most of you that. But it also illuminates something larger in the national politics of slavery about these ranking of priorities that people had. And in fact, the importance of Maine and the Maine context, the state level context for this debate in Maine necessitates actually, from the point of view of Mainers, a change in the name that we normally give to this crisis. It's common in textbooks and in lectures to talk about the Missouri Crisis, this hot debate between 1819 and 1821 about Missouri statehood. It's common to talk about the Missouri Compromise. But Mainers knew it the way they described it over and over again is, the way one person put it, the great question of Maine and Missouri. So I've come to think of it as the Maine and Missouri Crisis from the Maine point of view. So let me tell that story and some of its highlights, and of course, happy to answer any questions. The basic context is the long struggle for statehood. Maine began, of course, as a district of Massachusetts and had, it would be not too much of a stretch to call it a colonial relationship with Massachusetts proper, and especially with Boston. The work of the great historian Alan Taylor, some of his early work a long time ago-ish, described a struggle in Maine between what they call Liberty men, who are usually squatters on the land owned by land speculators, and the great proprietors, who were those land speculators who had a legal claim to the land, but had no intention of occupying it themselves. They were speculators in land, and these liberty men were squatting on that land, and it became a legal but also a political struggle. And the great proprietors, many of them were English, that did not help their image in post-revolutionary politics, but also many of them were headquartered in Boston. And Boston came to kind of represent that colonial capital from the Maine point of view to these liberty men. A lot of this got funneled into partisan politics and the great rivalry between the Federalist Party, who sided with the great proprietors in Boston, and the Democratic Republican Party, nationally attached to Jefferson and Madison, and that crowd, of course, I need to throw out the Federalists tied to Hamilton. Got that out of the way. That all call for shorthand the Republican Party. So the Democratic Republican Party, usually in that day, went by the name Republican Party, which is a bit confusing because they're not the forerunners of the modern day Republican Party, but the Liberty men came to be associated with the Republican Party, the Democratic Republican Party, and the Federalists with the great proprietors. And some of the rhetoric in these debates really struck me as I engaged with Alan Taylor's work. In one pamphlet, the writer came up with a fictitious dialogue. This is in 1797, right at the height of a lot of these debates between the great proprietors and the Liberty men. And this was a pro-Liberty man pamphlet in which the people sought for their liberty at the hands of the court, the insiders in Boston. And the court at one point responds to their pleas, "There is no liberty for you. Return to your sense of your duties, or we will chain you to your oars." "What?" cried the people. "Are we in Algiers?" Unquote. Now, Algiers was a place where many white people, Europeans and Americans, had been enslaved by North African pirates and North African states. And so that's a very pointed reference to the idea of this white slavery. And so interestingly enough, and this is reflective of the larger rhetoric that went on in this debate, the main slaveholders that Mainers were worried about were not in the South, but were in Boston. These allegorical slaveholders who were unaccountable to the people, who had control over these people's lives. To them, that represented slavery. And liberation would mean liberation from Boston's colonial kind of dominance over the District of Maine. Then the War of 1812 made the politics even more fraught in Maine and more divided. During this really unfortunate war from the American point of view, excuse me, Massachusetts proper and the authorities in Boston, there's no way to put it other than that they completely neglected and essentially abandoned Maine. There was not a strong effort on the part of the state authorities to protect Maine from British incursions, to assure the loyalty of Mainers who were smuggling goods to Canada, and so forth. This kind of sense of you're on your own in the middle of this really disastrous war from the point of view of many Americans only ratcheted up this drive for independence, liberation from Massachusetts and from Boston and what it represented. In the middle of this years-long fight to gain statehood, a group within the Democratic Republican Party emerged as leaders, and they came to be known as the Junto. The Junto was led by people like William King, major early Republican politician, John Holmes, who will figure largely in this story, Albion K. Parris, and William Pitt Preble. Those four and some of their followers were known as the Junto, who controlled the desire to, the drive to separate from Massachusetts, and headed the Republican Party in the midst of this partisan struggle over statehood. They were able to secure permission from Massachusetts, in the state legislature in Boston, to have a statehood convention in 1816, provided they got a certain amount of the popular vote. They didn't quite reach that. That stated percentage of the popular vote for statehood. So that they met in Brunswick, Maine. The Brunswick Convention ended in failure because they didn't have the requisite popular mandate. But in 1819, another ballot happened, and they got the requisite mandate, the requisite number of voters for statehood in 1819. And so that goes to the state legislature, and the state legislature, this is crucial to the story here. The state legislature in Boston agreed to let Maine become a state with that backing of those voters, provided that Congress accepted that statehood by March 4th, 1820. So it set a deadline. Congress has to admit you into the Union by the constitutional mechanism by March 4th, 1820. So this was in 1819, and it looked like smooth sailing in Congress. The statehood bill started wending its way through Congress. But then on December 30th, 1819, so a little over 3 months before the March 4th deadline, Henry Clay, Speaker of the House of Representatives in Congress, in the middle of a struggle over whether Missouri would come in as a state, decided to link the statehood of Maine and the statehood of Missouri into a way to compromise between a free state coming in. Everyone knew Maine would be coming in as a free state. They had already drafted a state constitution that would abolish slavery for good. And Missouri, and of course the central struggle in the Missouri crisis, the Maine and Missouri crisis now, was whether to restrict slavery in Missouri. The minute Clay tied Maine and Missouri together on December 30th, 1819, everything changed for the Maine representatives. The immediate response in Maine is outrage and shock, as represented in the newspapers, both editorials and letters to the editor, public meetings. But the direction that outrage and shock would take Mainers was very unclear. Some people were outraged that they would be tied to the fate of slavery in Missouri, and therefore were strengthened in their desire to restrict slavery in Missouri. Others found this really good reason to compromise. Let us get our statehood by this price if that's what it takes. So there's outrage and shock, but in a way that divided Mainers. And what's interesting is that sets a pattern in which both sides, both the dough faces in Maine and the restrictionists, claim a popular mandate. And they're right to claim a popular mandate because Mainers were deeply divided based on the number of public meetings and the letters to the editor. Of course, we don't have polling data, but that's what we've got, is a divided and bitterly now divided Maine population. The Junto, these leaders, William King, John Holmes, and that crowd, very quickly chose to embrace dough-facism, to argue that this linking of Maine's fate with Missouri's dictated compromise in voting for the Clay's Missouri Compromise. The Eastern Argus, it was the leading Republican newspaper. It was controlled by the Junto. It was a Portland newspaper and functioned as the party organ, the leading party organ in Maine. It was edited by Francis Douglas, and he wrote an editorial immediately in reaction to the compromise measure being proposed. Quote, "If this bill for our admission does not become a law before the 4th of March, all that we have done is lost." And he's talking about that years-long struggle, at least since 1816, but even before that, for statehood. And all the work of conventions and voting would have to be done again before we attain our independence. And that's a very loaded political word, of course, in the American lexicon, the idea of independence from a colonial power, and that's the way Mainers felt about, a large percentage of Mainers felt about Boston and Massachusetts. Douglas laid down the Junto's line of kind of dictation. Congressmen from the district must make our admission sure, and of course, our emancipation perfect. It's a very interesting word in the context of a debate over slavery in Missouri. The emancipation he cared about and the junto declared that they would care about, is Mainers' emancipation from Boston. So that is a telling statement of, again, in David Potter's terms, the ordering of priorities. We're not going to talk about in this editorial that kind of launches this campaign on behalf of the junto. We're not going to talk about slavery in Missouri. We need to be willing to compromise over that in order to secure our own emancipation. One of the representatives from the district that was the most anguished about what to do was Mark Langdon Hill. Reading Mark Langdon Hill's papers at the Maine Historical Society, I got anguished. Like, it was painful. The guy was truly, like, painfully undecided about what to do. He was constantly asking for direction. He was a Republican, so he was constantly asking for direction from the junto, but even then he wasn't sure whether to act on it. Meanwhile, John Holmes, his fellow congressman and a leader of the junto, just got to work rather than wring his hands. He worked behind the scenes with key administration officials to help line up votes with patronage and so forth. And then he offered a really important speech on January 27th on the floor of Congress. By that point, restrictionists who wanted to restrict slavery in Missouri had called doughfaces and would-be doughfaces in the North pro-slavery. Either you're with us or against us. So in response to that, on January 27th, 1820, John Holmes thundered, "We are not the abettors of slavery. For one, sir, I would rejoice if there was not a slave on earth. But though my feelings are strong for the abolition of slavery, they are yet stronger for the Constitution of my country. And if I am reduced to the sad alternative to tolerate the holding of slaves in Missouri or violate the Constitution of my country, I will not admit a doubt to cloud my choice." That was so because abolition under his reading of the Constitution would prove no benefit if it came at the sacrifice of the Constitution. Because the Constitution was the ultimate guarantor of liberty for Americans, not only Americans, but all of mankind, actually. So the stakes involved were the preservation of this great instrument of liberty. More to the local point, from his Maine point of view, John Holmes argued that restricting slavery in Missouri would violate the Constitution because then Congress could not admit a new state with less political rights than the others, unquote. So he didn't want Missouri to have to come in as a second-class citizen with Congress having restricted its ability to legislate for itself. He felt that keenly as a Mainer right on the cusp of gaining Maine statehood. So it's both an argument to the Union and the Constitution, but also for the idea of state rights, which is not what we normally associate with the North, but was a strong appeal in Maine politics at this precise moment. Restrictionists framed the issue very differently. They wanted to reduce all these other issues down to a question of, are you pro-slavery or anti-slavery? And that way pressure Northern representatives to vote for restriction in slavery in Missouri. William King, interestingly enough, the leader of the junto, his half-brother was Rufus King, who became the leading restrictionist in the Senate. And he gave some really notoriously anti-slavery, kind of extremely anti-slavery speeches in which he denied slavery based on natural law and so forth. He framed the issue this way. Rufus King, New York senator. "Freedom and slavery are the parties which stand but this day before the Senate and the nation." That's it. Freedom or slavery. Which side are you on? Francis Douglas, the editor of the Eastern Argus, responded to that. "We believe we would go as far to extirpate slavery as the restrictionists, but do not let the question be misrepresented or misunderstood. It is simply this." So you can say what you think the question is, Rufus King, but this is the question. It is simply this: provided the admission of Maine into the Union cannot otherwise be effected, will you consent that the people of Missouri may form a constitution to suit themselves? Putting Maine at the center of the story seemed to make good political sense to Francis Douglas. For the restrictionists in Maine, he jibed, "It is but a trifling sacrifice, if indeed any, that Maine should not be admitted to the Union. We had better leave Massachusetts to regulate our affairs and employ ourselves in regulating the affairs in Missouri." Self-control, self-government, the restrictionists, he was arguing, were leaving for ourselves and trying to, while they tried to restrict people in Missouri from governing themselves. And this division very quickly within the congressional representation, as well as within Maine in general, led to really personal attacks on both sides. They just were exasperated with each other, especially the doughfaces in Maine, who saw that the price of the goal to be won was Maine statehood, and these restrictionists were abandoning Mainers. Really just jump out of all the correspondence as well as the newspapers that I read in the course of this research. In Portland, William Pitt Preble described the state of suspense while waiting for news on Maine's admission as truly intolerable. And then as that March 4th deadline approached and no compromise had yet been secured, Mark Langdon Hill, back in Washington, reported irritations increased within the Maine delegation in Washington. For the doughfaces, he and John Holmes were the two doughfaces within the seven, were convinced that the members from Maine could settle the question if they would all agree to the proposed compromise. But they wouldn't do it, those restrictionists. Holmes had no use for the restrictionists, and he particularly had a personal animus against Joshua Cushman, a Maine representative who was a restrictionist. He saw Cushman as particularly dangerous. He called him dangerous in his correspondence. And in late February, March 4th is approaching, no compromise in sight. He griped that a compromise grows more and more doubtful because some of our conscientious members from Maine have, I'm told, declared that they would sacrifice Maine before they would allow slavery beyond the Mississippi. So in private, as well as in their public spin on the issues involved, they could not believe these people were willing to put some anti-slavery agenda out in the West ahead of Maine statehood. And it just led to this sense of personal grievance against the restrictionists amongst the doughfaces, and of course vice versa. But also, interestingly, everywhere else in Northern politics, doughfaces were treated by many of their constituents, most of their constituents, as kind of the essence of weakness. They were soft on slavery. They had dough faces, like Jell-O or the Pillsbury Doughboy. But in the Maine context, people like Holmes were arguing that restrictionism was the essence of weakness, being willing to sacrifice the most important thing for some lesser thing because they thought that popular opinion would support them. So the extreme tension of these weeks, especially for Maine representatives and constituents, finally broke on March 2nd, 1820, 2 days before that deadline, when the House of Representatives in Washington agreed to the Senate's compromise measures, and the first Missouri Compromise went through, allowing Maine as a free state, Missouri in as a slave state, drawing that line within the rest of the Louisiana Purchase territories at the southern boundary of Maine at the 3630 parallel, the famous Missouri Compromise. But I want to argue it was the Maine and Missouri Compromise, especially for people in Maine. It couldn't be understood in no other way. But interestingly enough, the tension broke. There was a great sense of relief amongst Mainers, but that did not stop the political haggling and squabbling and spin over what had just happened and who was responsible for what. Both locally and nationally, restrictionists absolutely savaged the doughfaces. They pilloried them in the press, in public meetings. They burned effigies of them. I just want to give a couple examples of the kind of hostility that restrictionists faced when they went back to their districts. One senator, as one account read, who had voted for slavery, he would have disputed that, but the way the account was run, this doughface who had voted for slavery in the Senate returned to his home state, and a highly respectable gentleman refused to shake his hand. Seeing the senator's astonishment, this gentleman told the senator, in the presence of another senator who had also voted for slavery, another doughface, "I cannot shake hands with a man who has the blood of thousands on his hands." This was high stakes. This was very personal, and these interactions showed it to be such. The little kind of written formulation of this that has most stuck in my memory across the years that I've done this research is a particularly aggrieved poet, I guess. He rhymed. I'm not sure he would be known as a poet, but kind of a scribbler in a newspaper. Decried the spectacle of Northern representatives showing themselves to be venal statesmen, corrupt statesmen, bartering souls away. And concluded his little squib, "Cursed be the wretch who sells his vote for pelf. Let him, like Judas, go and hang himself." Yikes. I mean, the restrictionists were beyond aggravated that the compromise had actually gone through and that slavery would come in without any, Missouri would come in without any restriction on slavery. The junto found themselves in a position of strength relative to other doughfaces in other states because they had secured, by the means of supporting the compromise, Maine statehood. But this sort of thing, refusing to shake people's hands, calling them Judas, really did worry them. And they worried about a backlash, even amongst Maine voters. Excuse me. And so in the immediate aftermath of the compromise's passage, leading Republican Asher Ware, a leading Republican politician, warned William King that the restrictionists were determined to avail themselves of the honest and natural repugnance that is felt for slavery amongst Mainers, to injure the political standing of Holmes and Hill. John Holmes and Mark Langdon Hill had voted for the compromise measure, were doughfaces, on account of their vote on the compromise. "You know how important their vote was to us gaining statehood," he wrote. "Ought we to suffer them to be sacrificed? They were willing to compromise. We have to defend them rather than let them being sacrificed to public opinion." Douglas, in the Eastern Argus, as usual, he led the defense team of Holmes and Hill. And in a very telling editorial, he wrote, "There will not be one slave less in the United States by restricting Missouri. Not one more slave in the United States if Missouri found slavery restricted. Because the United States had banned the foreign slave trade, it will be merely transferring slaves from one part of the United States, the older slave states, to another, the newer slave states, like now Missouri. Slavery, therefore, would have continued to expand itself whether Missouri was a territory or a state. Therefore, Congress had consulted for the happiness of the slaves." Interesting way to formulate that. "Men of humanity and patriotism, therefore, should credit Holmes and Hill for having secured the meritorious measure of statehood by means of their political wisdom. And of course, had they been as zealous as their colleagues to excite the jealousy of the North against the South, the restrictionists, Maine would have been a province of Massachusetts still." That's the real payoff. He argued that the Missouri Compromise was not really a choice between two evils. It was of kind of a neutral effect on slaves at worst, and a positive benefit for the free people of Maine, who were now fully free from Massachusetts domination. Interestingly, Holmes and Hill, like all the other doughfaces, found themselves compelled to write their own defense pieces. You can read, they're very widely available and reprinted, the defenses published in the newspapers, or sometimes as pamphlets, of these 18 doughfaces, who chose, some of whom did not choose to run for office, so it's not for re-election, so it's not all 18. But Holmes and Hill wrote their own defense pieces. What's interesting to me is to read the correspondence with especially William King. William King was going to be the first governor. He was the leader of the junto. He kind of dictated politics from Portland, the head of the junto. And to read the correspondence between William King and those two representatives, Holmes and Hill, is to see how they carefully parsed every argument and tried out phrases before they went into the pamphlet and so forth. So even though they were coming from a position of strength, they had gained statehood, they understood that this was a minefield and they needed to be very careful in the way that they addressed these issues. And it was in this context that probably the most famous moment in Holmes's life happened. And most people don't even know it was Holmes. On April 22nd, 1820, Thomas Jefferson, watching all these developments from Monticello, he wrote to John Holmes to kind of do a postmortem on what had just happened and what had just ended with what he hoped had ended with the compromise measure of March 2nd. Of course, he was wrong, that the politics was still ongoing. And in that context of those politics, he wrote some of the most famous phrases, even in the Jefferson lexicon. It's in that letter that he said that Southerners had a wolf by the ear, slavery. We can neither hold that wolf, slavery, safely, nor safely let it go. He also said that he had not really been paying attention to politics, which was absolute rubbish. That was total spin, until the Missouri question awakened him as a fire bell in the night. So some of these famous wolf by the ear, fire bell in the night, come in this letter to Holmes explaining the perils Jefferson saw in the Missouri debates for the Union. And therefore it was written to praise Holmes as a leading doughface who had taken a lot of fire from restrictionists. He had become kind of the bête noire of the restrictionists and kind of the arch doughface. And so Jefferson wrote this to kind of prop him up and give him a little pep talk. Really tellingly, he towards the end of the letter, he concludes, "To yourself, John Holmes, as the faithful advocate of the Union, I tender the offering of my high esteem and respect." Unquote. Jefferson was not going to call him a defender of slavery. What John Holmes had done was to defend the Union. That was the kind of anti-restrictionist way of spinning that, unless you were in the Deep South, where it was okay to openly say we had defended slavery. Interestingly enough, and unsurprisingly enough, John Holmes, this was like the best day of his life when he got this letter from the revered founder, Thomas Jefferson. He showed it around to his friends, his family, proudly at this and that gathering in Portland, and so forth. Many of his friends urged him to publish it. This is like the ultimate vindication of the doughface, to have Thomas Jefferson give you his seal of approval. But interestingly enough, Jefferson, when asked by Holmes in correspondence, refused to let him publish it. This was meant to be kind of a private pep talk to reward Holmes for his doughfacism. So Holmes did not publish it until Jefferson died on July 4th, 1826, 50 years after the Declaration of Independence. At that point, in the midst of yet another Maine struggle in Maine that also involved slavery and it intersected with national politics, Holmes thought it would be really useful to publish this pay into his doughfacism from the sainted founder, the sainted father, Thomas Jefferson. So in 1826, after Jefferson had died, he felt free to publish this. So that's the doughface side of the spin, both privately and publicly. But what struck me as I did this research is that unlike restrictionists anywhere else that I could find, Maine restrictionists, those 5 members of Congress who had voted against the Missouri Compromise, the Maine and Missouri Compromise, they did what nobody else had to do. They defended themselves in public. They themselves had to write these kind of explanatory, defensive newspaper editorials or pamphlets and so forth. As soon as the compromise passed and Maine gained its statehood, in spite of them, there's one way to look at that, Maine's restrictionist representatives in Congress, Martin Kinsley, Joshua Cushman, Ezekiel Whitman, and Enoch Lincoln, 4 of the 5, decided they must do so. So on March 7th, actually, they jointly published, just 5 days after the compromise, a joint circular pamphlet that was going to go around Maine. In this, they cautioned that if the people of the North proved inattentive to the South's drive to dominate America, we shall deserve to be considered a besotted and stupid race, fit only to be led blindfold by the South, and worthy only to be treated with sovereign contempt. Henry Clay's scheme, they argued, to tie Maine and Missouri's fate was, as it respects the members from Maine, in the highest degree insidious. What did Clay and the Senate virtually say to the members from Maine? Was it not this? They said to Mainers, you desire the admission of Maine. You are under the strongest necessity of obtaining it. We have no objection to it. You ought to have it, but you shall not have it unless you vote against the restriction on Missouri, whatever may be your sentiments or however abhorrent it may be to your notions of the rights of man and humanity, unquote. So in the restrictionist telling, they were being extorted by Henry Clay because he understood the drive for statehood in Maine. And so therefore they were going to have to sacrifice their dearest principles, their anti-slavery principles, to the altar of statehood based on Henry Clay being the high priest of compromise. And they would not do that. So they stood not as emblems of weakness in their own telling. They were the ultimate strong politicians who were unwilling to bend to such pressure. To me, that whole exchange in the public prints showed how dicey the situation was in Maine. In sharp contrast to other states, especially in the mid-Atlantic, states like New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey were united behind, at least in their representatives and senators, behind restriction. In Maine, it was hotly divisive in the ways I've tried to lay out. But even then, after all this post-spin, it wasn't done. For not only Missouri, they drafted a constitution that had a guarantee of slavery and a deprivation of the right of Black people to even migrate as free people to Missouri. And so that touched off Missouri Compromise or Crisis Part 2 in Congress and throughout the country. But also, as if to underscore that fate had marked out John Holmes for controversy. John Holmes, his term, he became one of the 2 senators from Maine on a mission of the state. But later in 1820, he came up for reappointment. So his term was only a few months old, and the Maine legislature had to debate whether John Holmes should go back to the Senate to fill out a full 6-year term. So in the midst of this post-compromise recrimination battle, John Holmes, the arch-doe-face, comes up for reappointment by the state legislature. And so therefore you get serious attacks by Mainers on Holmes as the ultimate kind of weak-kneed compromiser, led by his nemesis, Representative Joshua Cushman. Joshua Cushman argued that the moral sense and political sentiments in the eastern section of the country, New England, recoil from the very idea of slavery and holding any portion of the human race in bondage, unquote. But John Holmes had facilitated that by his vote earlier in 1820. The junto, of course, responded with some ad hominem attacks on Cushman, but also to reshape the rhetoric of slavery. Douglas, in an editorial, let it not be said that these men who had voted for Maine statehood are going to be sacrificed for a vote which emancipated them from foreign masters. There's that important term again. We got our emancipation from Boston. Don't sacrifice them to some kind of abstract anti-slavery principle. The real slavery here was our former slavery to Boston. Interestingly enough, there are legislative elections and popular elections in late 1820, in the fall of 1820. And interestingly enough, Mainers showed just how divided they were by their votes. On January 30th, 1821, Holmes won reappointment to the Senate with a 92-30 vote well, there were 92 for him, 30 for his second place finisher, and 17 scattering votes. So really 92-47 is a decisive vote to send John Holmes back. 15 state senators voted for Holmes and only 3 voted against him. Mark Langdon Hill, the other doughface, won re-election to the House of Representatives. But so did 3 of the 4 restrictionists who were running for re-election. Everyone but Martin Kinsley. It was almost as if, well, it is as if, 2 things. One, Mainers remained deeply divided, but the fact that all these incumbents kind of go back, most of these incumbents go back, to me it sent the message that maybe Mainers thought all's well that ends well. We got our statehood, let's just send them back. It's an interesting moment. Maine's doughfaces declared victory as a result of all this, but so did restrictionists. And they both kind of had good reason. The people seem to have supported both. But their overall experience, Maine's doughfaces, ran counter to the national experience for doughfaces. Because of the context of Maine politics, as I hope I've demonstrated, only in Maine could you pose as both a doughface and a liberator. Thanks for your attention. And I'm happy to take questions.
All right, thank you very much, Professor Mason. So to get us started off here. So first, starting a bit small, actually, I'm just curious because I love the insult doughfaces. So I was wondering, in lamenting the sort of lack of colorful political insults that survive, do you have any other favorites? Like I always liked hunkers and barn burners from like antebellum New York or something, but there are any other gems that the audience should be aware of?
Yeah, I was thinking about hunkers and barn burners. I mean, what's interesting to me is doughface is clear number 1. Everyone else is playing for second place, but some of those are pretty good. What's fascinating to me is some of these epithets get adopted by the people that they were at first attached to, and others don't. So interestingly, this isn't exactly an answer to your question, but because I can't think of anything that even rivals doughfaces as an awesome insult.
Fair.
As a result of that, no doughface ever called themselves a doughface. Like there was nobody, you know what, I actually am a doughface. Unlike, say, Christians who ultimately adopted that original insult, or Mormons. I'm a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and that was initially an insult, a bunch of Mormons. Well, okay, sure, we're Mormons. Nobody said, you know what, I am a doughface. They strenuously resisted because it carried those connotations of weakness and pro-slavery. So, yeah, that's an indirect answer to your question, but again, I just can't think of anything quite as good as doughface.
Sure. So also turning to a different form of language. So you point out that, you know, Mainers are talking about emancipating their state from Boston. And of course, you know, historians were well aware of this long history of rhetoric among white Americans from the American Revolution to antebellum white workers in the 1830s and 40s saying, oh, we're enslaved and we shouldn't be a slave and whatever. So I'm wondering though, did any folks like some abolitionists or other people in Maine, for example, in the press you were aware of, push back on this sort of metaphorical catastrophizing and say things like, whoa, 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 you know, we don't like massholes, but we're not really slaves? Or did you not find that?
No, that's a great question. I find that from the American Revolution forward, right? I mean, American revolutionaries run around talking about the Stamp Act as slavery, and plenty of loyalists as well as pro-parliamentary Britons back in the home country say, what? Are you serious? You know what real slavery is. You are practicing it, right? So there's pushback from the immediate usage in American politics of that, and in Maine politics and in antebellum politics. in general, there is this argument, really, that's an abuse of the term slavery. It is completely illegitimate. And they turn on them with, what's surprising to me from one point of view is the viciousness between restrictionists and doughfaces. But it in part is this kind of the bitterness of this divorce scenario in which we thought we had these shared terms, freedom, slavery. We thought we knew what they meant. And you are completely abandoning that, but also betraying the original understanding of those terms by these abuses of, that is beyond ridiculous. It's offensive. So multiple restrictionists in 1819 through 1821, but also anti-slavery activists did exactly what you're saying, to say that is absolute rubbish to use that term.
Interesting, thank you. So now we have a question actually from Jamie Rice about the indication as to why Thomas Jefferson didn't want his letter published.
Yeah, that is a great question, because it contained a lot of the seeds of, or kind of the elements of how you're spinning doughfacism. But what's interesting is historians who have studied Thomas Jefferson's correspondence during the Missouri Crisis have shown that Jefferson was tailoring his message to the audience. I mean, everybody does that, but he was doing that in pretty extreme ways, emphasizing very different things when he was writing John Holmes as opposed to when he was writing James Madison or some representative from South Carolina. And so if all those had been published, he would have been shown to be completely inconsistent. And he could have defended himself, well, I was really emphasizing one element over another. But in some of these letters to Southern representatives, he was much more open about we had defended slavery than he was certainly with his emphasis on defending the Union to someone like John Holmes. So if all of those would have gotten out in 1820, it would have exposed him as playing fast and loose and kind of playing politics and being inconsistent, all of which was counter to his image of kind of, oh, I'm above politics. I'm just in retirement here in Monticello. I'm not playing politics. It would have shown exactly that he was. And so I think it was to preserve that kind of sage of Monticello image that he wanted to purvey. That's a great question.
Interesting. Would you find him something that I sometimes pitch for my students when we read his writing is that Jefferson, obviously his views change over time, but could best be summed up as anti-slavery in terms of, well, it's all really a shame, but whatever you want to do about it is way, way worse.
Right. That is a really good way to, anti-abolitionist. He kind of is in that tradition that is a long tradition that stretches into the antebellum period. But he was especially aggrieved when slavery got politicized. So during the War of 1812, for instance, when New England Federalists were politicizing the 3/5 clause, by which Southerners had gained an advantage in the House of Representatives and therefore led America into this disastrous war, for him that was really, really dangerous. And then he saw it happening again in the Missouri Crisis. So there's no way in which he was slumbering and didn't know that slavery was somehow a political issue until the Missouri. This fire bell in the night thing is absolute rubbish, and he knew it when he wrote it. But because he had understood, anytime slavery gets politicized and it gets attached to partisan politics, then you might get sectional politics, North uniting against South, and there's the end of that union. So the political effects, especially of anti-slavery, he was really wary of. And that's what he's communicating in a lot of these letters, including his letter to John Holmes.
Well, we'll have to get into that later about whether or not Jefferson was truly just a Southern sectionalist. But we have a couple of great questions from the audience I want to make sure we get through. Sue Hartgrove asks, if the dough-face restrictionist controversy, it seems like maybe today could be seen as like what we might call an inside the Beltway issue. Were most Mainers as into this controversy as much as their elected officials?
Yeah, that's a great question. We don't have polling data, but again, what we do have is records of public meetings that are very well attended. They're orchestrated by the political leaders, but they are very well attended and very enthusiastic affairs. not just in Portland, but in a variety of other towns. And then we also have many, many letters to the editor. And we also have voter turnout. And that's probably the best way to see whether only politicians care about these issues. And voter turnout throughout the early republic, not just in Maine, but this holds true in Maine. When issues are hotly contested and you can clearly tell the difference between the two parties, they're not obfuscating those differences, voter turnout is very high. I mean, it's astronomically high by modern 21st century standards, but it goes even above the normal standards of the early republic. So those elections in late 1820 and then the legislative elections in early 1821, but those popular elections in late 1820 see really high voter turnout because the issues seem so pressing and the distinction between doughface and restrictionist seems so strong. And there are other issues as well in Maine politics, but those are our best evidences that this is not just a Washington thing or a Portland Junto kind of thing. It's people are getting worked up. Your average constituent is getting worked up about this stuff.
Okay, thank you. Now we have a very sort of specific question from Eric Burren, mentioning a scholar I don't think I'm as familiar with, but Forbes argues that he says he thinks that restrictionists made some procedural mistakes in Congress during the first Maine and Missouri Crisis in terms of how they sort of controlled parliamentary maneuvers. Was this in fact the case, that there were just sort of, you know, tactical errors on the part of restrictionists, or not?
Yeah, Rob Forbes's book, Missouri Compromise and its Aftermath, really leans in on this idea that the important things that were happening, in many ways it relates to that last question. The Missouri crisis was really, the important things that were happening behind the scenes in Washington, not what people were debating and publishing. And so therefore he puts a lot of emphasis on that. I see that as really important, and it emerges in the correspondence, especially of John Holmes during this period. He's working the backroom channels to line up votes for doughfacism, for the compromise, and restrictionists were doing similarly, but restrictionists didn't have the levers of the national government, the executive branch. James Monroe was an ardent anti-restrictionist, very much in favor of the compromise, and so you can point to errors maybe that the restrictionists made, but to me the bigger issue is that they don't have really a lot of the levers of state power the way Henry Clay does, and especially the way James Monroe does. And then also I also push back against Rob Forbes's argument. In many ways it relates to my answer to the last question. I do think that the speeches mattered, and I do think that the voters mattered, and not just the backroom politics got things done in this era of politics.
Interesting, thank you. I want to keep us on schedule. I'll say that obviously I work in very different areas, but that certainly confirms with a lot of findings, right, from scholars that ordinary people often cared about, you know, big, faraway stuff, and we shouldn't assume that, you know, when we talk about sort of ordinary people's concerns, that didn't mean politics and, you know, all the rest. Esoteric though some of that might be to us. Early modernists always are fascinated by people getting very interested in these doctrinal disputes that today people struggle to parse. Keeping us along, I wanted to direct a point of 2020 for you before we take our quick intermission and then the roundtable, and that is so the sort of politics of statehood. And of course, the politics of statehood has come up recently regarding Puerto Rico statehood, but then most recently DC statehood, and since particularly that would be, it's about a 50% African-American city and now state that is freighted with potential sort of moral and political ramifications, right? And so I was wondering if any of your work with regarding this Missouri and Maine statehood issue gave you any perspectives about today's debates.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think there's some parallels here in that it's important to really investigate what really are you talking about in these debates. I did not live long in the DC area. I did my graduate work at the University of Maryland before I learned pretty much everything in DC comes back to race. Like pretty much every debate is going to end up, race is going to be part of it, no matter what you think the origins of that debate. was, and that's definitely going to be true about any debates over statehood for DC. And similarly, my work shows that there's times when people are talking about slavery, but then you have to think, what are they really talking about? And so when they're using rhetoric like slavery to Boston, what they're using that is as an analogy, as a metaphor, as a loaded metaphor, but it's slavery politics in service of some other central issue. And so are you talking about slavery there, or are you talking about that other central issue? The answer generally is yes, but if you had to choose, it's that other issue, and that slavery is being devoted to that pursuit of that issue. To me, it's always fascinating in whether it's local, state, or national politics to really think about what is the core issue here and what are the strategies being used to pursue that issue. And so I think definitely, especially just with my experience with DC politics, the idea that race is going to be central, it will never surprise me.
Interesting. And to me, I was speaking with somebody about this, the idea that the consideration of, which side will get the senators specifically, has always been present whenever America, so the idea that any state has ever entered the Union, and not had people mental math about how is this going to change the balance of power in the Senate. I certainly can't think of a time, right? And maybe somebody can. Thank you so much. So we're going to get back to Matthew Mason, joined by the rest of our superlative panelists at 1:45 Eastern. So Matt, by all means, refill your cup, whatever. Make yourself comfortable. We will all have our smiling faces, and then I'll ask the folks to keep their mics muted until I direct. And if you guys want to, sorry for the folks for Inside Baseball, but we have the all panelist chat box. So if you want to indicate and go yes or something, and then I'll point to you, and that way we can keep us all from interfering on each other's sound bites. But so don't go away, audience. We're going to come to a stirring climax of the day's proceedings with an all scholar roundtable in which they speak with each other about some of these issues, and then field your, as always, relevant and insightful questions. Don't go away, everybody. And